to do with next year, but either for the time being. Okay. Short Parsha, but extremely seminal and central Parsha, obviously because of the fact that this is the Parsha that Moshe Rabbeinu has the Gezer, it's finally sealed against him. He's not going to Israel. The lesson breaks down that with Moshe Rabbeinu unable to enter Israel, it was the last time a single individual could bring the Gula. He had the capability, the capacity to bring the Gula on his own, to be Mashiach, and once the whole incident with the rock happened, so that basically closed the door. From that point on, it takes Klal Yisrael. For the majority, all of it, not all of it can necessarily happen, but certainly the role of Klal Yisrael had to be someone involved in the process to bring the Gula. So it's a very important turning point, and also, one Parsha is a phenomenal thing. You lose three of perhaps the greatest people in history. You lose Miriam, you lose Moshe Rabbeinu, you lose our first article. Sorry, you don't lose Moshe in this Parsha, but at least the Gezer that's going to die in the Midbar takes place in this week's Parsha. But it's not, there's a lot of important information. One of the most difficult things is the actual Gezer, what happens with the Sela, because what was Moshe thinking? Krish Baruch Hu said, speak to the rock, he hit the rock in the end. The Torah sort of glosses over the incident in terms of what actually happened. If it wasn't for the fact that Hashem comes back and says later on, Lo amantim bi, and because you didn't believe in me, you're not going to Israel, we wouldn't have noticed anything for the most part. I mean, maybe someone would have said that, hey, wasn't he supposed to speak to the rock? Did he just hit the rock? But the Torah says, hit the rock twice, the water came out, everybody's happy, and everything seems quite smooth until the Baruch Hu says, Lo amantim bi, and they have the Gezerah, and you go back and say, oh, wait a second, I must have missed something over here. What was going on? What was the cheshbon? What was the whole calculation? The Medrash fills in some of the parts, but like a lot of these deeper inyanim, that basically usually takes sod to unlock it and to see what's actually going on and get the lessons, the messages that really apply for all the generations to come, because the Torah is Morah, right? And it's not just there to recount history, but it's there to provide us with information that we need to know about in order to be able to fix things up. We are repair people. That's what we're doing, right? We're here to fix the world, tikkun olam, to attack on ourselves, and to do whatever was missing from the beginning of history at the end of history, in order to be able to get things back on track and bring Mashiach once and for all, and end all this disastrous, ridiculous that we keep living to a daily basis. Is that why is the death of Miriam? We start off with Paraduma, which of course doesn't even take place in this week's Parsha. Actually, historically, this week's Parsha, the beginning of the Parsha, goes back to the second year of the Jewish people in the Midbar, when they had to do the part, didn't become purified, for Pesach, whatever they're going to do after that. And the death of Miriam takes place at this time, historically, the 40th year after living Mitzrayim. The question is why the juxtaposition? And I know what you're thinking, if you saw the Gemara in Moed Katan, you already know the answer to this question, but of course the answer is deeper than that, because there's lots of places you could teach us. Well, first of all, what's the message? The Gemara Moed Katan says the reason why they're juxtaposed over here is because to teach you, just like Karbanis and Mechaper, right, for Bnei Yisrael, likewise are the death of tzaddikim, how apropos, because today we lost one of our gedolim, right? So that they're mechaper also for the generation. The juxtaposition of Miriam's death at the Paraduma is to teach you that halacha, right, or that the hashkafa, that particular point, which is peculiar because you could have done it with the death of Aaron or the death of Moshe later on, or some of the tzaddik in the past, back to Chur by Har Sinai, and second of all, of all the karbanis, to use as the example for this idea that Paraduma is the least likely. We're not even makrid in the Mizbeach. Instead, what we do basically is we burn it to ashes and put it together with water. We sprinkle the person, right? And it's not so much mechaper as much as matahir. The word mechate is used for sprinkling, but it's not so much mechaper as much as to matahir the person who maybe didn't even do a chet. He came in contact with a dead person. That's all he did basically. And this is matahir. So why that specific juxtaposition? So the Gemara doesn't really give the whole story. The Gemara gives a true point, and it's certainly what a line of thinking. But there must be more to that juxtaposition than simply what the Gemara is saying. Second question is that why was the incident with the bear Miriam the cause of the decree against Moshe Rabbeinu? Because we'll see, why does the question even exist in the first place? Because it's really because of Miriam. The bear Miriam is called obviously bear Miriam because it's B'schus Miriam, And the reason why it's B'schus Miriam is because she was the one really responsible for Moshe's birth. She was the one who told Amram, because you know the whole story, go back directly to the beginning of Shmos, that everybody divorced their wives because Paro made a decree to kill all the first, all the firstborn males, right? And Miriam said to her father, you know, Paro only decreed against the males, and the females would survive. That's really what builds Klal Yisrael, because it goes to the mother and the women, the Jewish line. So if women had been born and not men, there still would have been Jewish people, even if the fathers had been Egyptians. Not the best mixture, but certainly would have been a technical reality that would have saved Klal Yisrael's existence. But you're going ahead and you're being gozer against the men and the women by not having children. Amram heard the story, heard the Pshat. Whatever he did, the generation did after him. He took back Yocheved, and immediately after was born Moshe. So Miriam was the one who basically facilitated the birth of the Moshiach of Klal Yisrael from the very beginning, and it was her prophecy, the Gemara in Sota says, that she basically said that he would be the one to save Klal Yisrael. So in the beginning, when she made that prophecy and Moshe was born, it says Amram came along and kissed her on the head because she was obviously right. She was only 6 years old at the time, which is pretty good for a 6-year-old. Such a thing of a prophecy historically. And then later on, when they had to hide him because of the gezer to throw them into the river, so that he gave a punch in the head because where's your prophecy right now? But she was the source of Moshe's, coming to the world and being what he was and freeing Klal Yisrael like she predicted. And the Be'er is named after her because just like she was the life force for the Jewish people vis-a-vis her prophecy, likewise the Be'er was the water, the miraculous water that fed everyone in the Midbar as well. So it's unusual that the bear itself should be the reason why Moshe himself cannot fulfill his mission. It's exactly the opposite. It's kind of like an oxymoron. It's contradictory. Because if anything, that should be sacred in terms of Moshe's mission. Find another way for him to have a decree of Gezer, because there's lots of examples, perhaps, the Chumash that might have resulted. Because look at the crime, look at the punishment. I mean, what did Moshe do by the bear Miriam, by hitting the rock that warranted the punishment of not going into Eretz Yisrael? Where's the Midah Keneged Midah? Is that what comes to your mind? Right? Take away his staff. Don't let him do miracles with it anymore. Whatever. But to ban, it's almost like Kosh Baruch Hu, and this is really what it is in the end, Kimat. It's almost as if Kosh Baruch Hu was looking for a way to get him not to go in, and this is the first thing he could pin it on. It's not shaveh. The crime and the punishment don't seem to match each other, seemingly. They do, of course, in the end. We'll see why. But that's the way it seems on the surface of it, right? So, why was he punished so severely, right? Not being able to enter Eretz Yisrael, like we said before. And since get the whole concept of chok in the first place, just what is a chok? I don't know if we'll get a chance to answer all these questions in one night, but these are things to think about in the meantime. And then after that, basically, why did Moshe, immediately after this whole episode, the Jewish people move on, and they're approaching the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and there's a shortcut and there's the long cut. The shortcut is across Eretz Edom. They go to the border of Edom, and they stay. They're talking to the people of Edom, who are not like the friendliest, nicest people to speak to. And Moshe goes into a whole historical account of what's gone on the last 40 years. Like they're interested. Like it's going to make a difference to them in the end. Why does Moshe feel compelled to do this? Probably knowing full well in the end they're going to reject his offer of doing business with the people in spite of the fact that they have their own food and their own water. Right? Why does he go through this whole story? The Gemara, as we mentioned, the Gemara says that Miriam was responsible. The question, in fact, becomes pretty much the answer in the end, because really the whole concept of paradigm, of course, is the idea of chok, of things that don't make sense to us, or at least they seem not to make sense to us. It's interesting the way Rashi phrases it. Rashi doesn't say it doesn't make sense to us, but rather what happens is it's a thing that the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world, they ask us about. Why can't you wear shabbos? Why can't you mix milk and meat together? Why do you have halachas of kloy? All these different things, and paradigm. How does it actually work? As the Gemara in Yuma says, Chachma right? Says Shlomo HaMelech, meaning that the Gemara says specifically it's unusual because it's one of the few situations where something that is matar somebody else, the process actually is matame the person doing it. Because like two people washing their hands at the same time, one guy sticks his hands into the water, his hands become clean, and the second guy puts his hand in the tap, and his hands become dirty. It's the exact same water, right? It's not that somehow it gets dirty in the process. So it's there's a concept behind here, but it's not that we can't understand it, we can't fathom it. Moshe Rabbeinu for sure understood the paraduma and what the halachas were and why, because there's certainly divine logic behind it. But it means that on a pshat level, it doesn't exactly fit in, because most of the laws that we relate to, they fit in a pshat level. Don't murder, don't steal, no adultery, all these different things. We can understand on a level of everyday life why these things are good for society, why we shouldn't do them. But a chok makes you have to think. You have to go into some kind of depth. So therefore, the paraduma, which if you kind of Latinize it a bit, kind of sounds a lot like paradox, which is exactly what the paraduma is all about. It's all about paradox. That was the chok, that was the part of the chachma that Shlomo Melech found difficult to fathom. But the idea of a paradox, and the idea of a paradox is something that really is the basis of Klal Yisrael through history to this very day. Going back to Avram Avinu, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him to bring Yitzchak up as a korban olah, and then first he promised that he'd be his heir for all the generations to come. Then he says, bring him up as a korban olah, and then he says, but bring him back down again. So this is a stira. The first time Avram didn't bother questioning, he thought it was a test of faith. But he had a question: how can he be my heir for all the generations to come at the same time that I should bring him up as a korban olah? And then after all of that, and I go ahead and do exactly what you say to do, you tell me to bring him back down once again. But now I have to ask the question: for a God that doesn't change his mind, you sure seem to change your mind a lot over here. So what's the shot? So Kosh Baruch Hu says, well, that's because of your assumption. You assume, as the Medrash says, that when I tell you to bring him up as a korban, means to sacrifice him, because that's what most people do. Most of the time, when you bring anything up as a sacrifice on the to the mizbech, the intention is to sacrifice him. So here's an exception. It doesn't have to be that way. And very often, when it comes to Kosh Baruch Hu, the odds of something can be so small, but if that's what Kosh Baruch Hu intends, it doesn't make a difference what the odds are in the end, because the Kosh Baruch Hu intends it. It's not a random thing. So we learned very early how to deal with the concept of paradox. The world has problems with that. That's why this very day science and religion still kind of struggle with each other, the belief of God, because of not so much contradiction anymore, but paradox. Although science is being forced over the years to actually makabel the idea of paradox. There are certain paradoxes in the universe that you can't avoid. They're just there. And for the most part, it's not a problem, because a contradiction is something that means that two ideas that coexist cannot coexist. One has to be wrong. A paradox means that two ideas seem contradictory, but there might be a way, if we just plug in the missing information, to find out how they actually can coexist, like Abraham by the Akedah. So that's the case. So then, what is the concept of chok ultimately? So the main idea basically is that it's not what you would have thought at the beginning. You have to go a little bit deeper and think into some more basically. So really, that's the reason for the juxtaposition of Miriam specifically in this week's Parshah by the paraduma. Yes, there are other karbanos that could have taught this lesson and should have been used instead of Parshas Vayikra someplace else, because you can teach it lots of ways. You can even make the point, by the way, without even having a tzaddik die. You could just make the point straight out and say, just like karbanos are mechaper, likewise the death of tzaddikim is mechaper as well. You can make that point. Why there specifically? Because the death of Miriam is a chok. That's what it's doing here. It's not just the death is mechaper, but it's a chok, her death. Why? Because if anybody deserved to enter the land, it was her. There's no reason why we would know of that she should die. Don't tell me old age, Basya, and what's her name? Yaakov's daughter.
The one the convert, Ruth?
No, the one who's saying that Yosef is alive, or Yosef Chai. Sarah, right? Sarah Basasha, right. Yeah, she lived. She was still living at this point in time. She went right there to Israel. Basya, the daughter of Paro, she survived. She made there to Israel, right? She was Miriam is the reason for the whole Gul in the first place, as we just said before. Second of all, she certainly wasn't involved in the chet of the Egel. She wasn't involved in the chet of the Meraglim. The women pretty much all went in because they weren't involved in any of the other shtuyot, right? So if anyone deserved to go to Eretz Yisrael, it was Miriam. She deserved to go to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the fact that she died in this week's Parsha itself represents a chok, and that's what the Torah is telling you by just opposing them, that not only is the death of tzaddikim mechaper, but it's also dealing with the idea of tzaddik v'ra'la, meaning that bad things do happen to good people, and you can't always understand why. We don't see the reason why in this week's Parsha, why Miriam should die specifically now at this time. Okay, to tell us that the bear is in her schus, okay, so the messenger, write it down someplace. There's other safer, more gentle ways of making this message besides the death of Miriam and the water drying out. There's something deeper going on over here. So if you recall, we have a similar situation. The quintessential example of tzaddik v'ra'lo is Eov, right? The story of Eov. Moshe wrote the book specifically because that's what people were troubled by all through history. The Gemara says that after he was able to get kapara for the golden calf and was on top of Har Sinai, Kosh Baruch was in a good mood, Moshe decided to ask a question, the best question he could possibly ask, because the rule is that you always have to leave your kashas in your back pocket. You never know when you're in the presence of a Talmud Chacham to ask a question. So Moshe was in the presence of the greatest Talmud Chacham ever, and he asked the prized question that all philosophers have dealt with, and that is tzaddik v'ra'lo. And he wrote the book Eov based upon, some say he wasn't answered, some say he was answered, but that was the question, of all the questions to ask, that's what was bothering him. Tzaddik v'ra'lo. That was the main issue that concerned Moshe Rabbeinu. And the book of Eov is the way that it's being dealt with. But if you look at the book itself, there's all kinds of anomalies, and the answer is there, but again, part of the answer of the book of Eov is that the answer is not on the surface. That's part of what Moshe writes, because it could have been much more clear about the whole story. In the end, basically, it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu giving Eov tochach and saying to him, were you there when I founded the earth? Were you there when this happened? Can you do this? Can you do that thing? I'm God. I can do all these things. So don't question me yet. So the answer most people get out of the book of Eov is, don't question, don't ask questions, because you can't understand everything. But the truth is, in the answers themselves, with the questions, the answers going on, the answer is there. But Moshe is saying, if you want that answer, you have to go deeper. The basic idea of Eov, again, the story of Eov seems to begin in the middle, where all of a sudden Kosh Baruch Hu, with the expression of all Tiftach Satan comes really from the story of Eov, because the Kosh Baruch Hu speaks to the Satan and says, and puts Eov in the spotlight, and literally calls him a tzaddik to the Satan. You don't do things like that because it just brings kitrug on a person, it just brings accusations. So it almost seems like Kosh Baruch Hu sets Eov up as a korban over here for no apparent reason other than the fact that he seems to be a tzaddik and remains pretty much a tzaddik for the most part, never speaking badly, but only thinking things in his heart after all that he's gone through. So the Rizal fills in the gap, and he says, because if you look at the pasuk, Yimin Hashem Tiretz Oyev in the Shir Shoyam, right? So he says the words Tiretz Oyev are the same letters as Tsaras Eov. So why is there an allusion to the Tsaras, the boils that Eov got here in the Shir Shoyam? So he says, because the Jewish people had a vision when they were crossing the Yam Suf, that had it not been for Eov, they wouldn't have survived. Why is that? Because the story of Eov begins when the Jewish people are by the Yam Suf. At that point in time, as the Gemara points out, the Midrash points out, that the Sitra Achra came and he wanted to, the Jewish people were Chayat Misa. They weren't supposed to cross the Yam. They had no schuyat to cross the Yam. They were literally being judged at that point in time. It's a makom sakana. At time of sakana, during times of sakana, you're being judged. They opened your file, and they saw that the Jewish people were Od Devodah Zorah, just like the Mitzrayim were Od Devodah Zorah, so therefore they were Chayat Misa. The only problem is that 4/5 were lost already in Mitzrayim, in Makas Choshech. This is the remaining one. If we drown these people, and the promise of Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak and Yaakov can't be fulfilled because no one's alive to carry on. So what does the Kodesh Baruch Hu do? He distracts the Sitra Achra. He pulls the Sitra Achra away from the Yam Suf. How does he do that? By saying, look at my righteous Eov over here. And the Sitra Achra says, I don't want to go look. I'm busy right now. I'm Mekatrik against the Jewish people. I got to deal with the situation. But yeah, Kodesh Baruch Hu says, yeah, but look how righteous this game is. This guy's top dollar over here. It's fantastic. And so the Sitra Achra, he can't not get involved in a situation like that. He goes over, and the whole story of Eov begins. And the moment the Sitra Achra leaves the Yam Suf, Kodesh Baruch Hu splits the sea, and the Jewish people cross, right? And they're saved because of Eov. The question is that fair? Why should Eov of all people be the default guy? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin says because Paro convened a council before he decided what to do with the Jewish people back in Mitzrayim, and he asked Yisro. Yisro said, "Don't touch them." Bilam said, "Of course, wipe them off, kill them, destroy them." And Eov pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Didn't want to give an opinion. The Zohar says a little bit differently. The Zohar says, he said, "Don't kill them, take their money, cause them suffering, but don't kill them because you'll get it back in the end." Because he knew historically, so that's why his money was taken. That's why he wasn't killed. The Sitrach was told he cannot take his neshama, he can take his money, he can cause his bodily harm and all that, because it's minik and the Gemara, the Zohar's Pshat fits in better than the Gemara's Pshat does over here. So from this, since he was not the vehicle to free the Jewish people back in Mitzrayim when he had the chance to, so measure for measure, he was the vehicle to free the Jewish people when they're standing by Yam Suf. So even though we're standing back at the story, you're missing a chunk of the story over here. Without knowing what the results, making the connection over, you would never know. I never knew before that the story of Eov began when the Jewish people were holding by Yam Suf and their backs were to the water, and the Egyptians were about to pass them. I had no idea. And the pasuk Yemin Hashem Tiritz Oyev, who would have thought that the words Tiritz Oyev are Tzaras Eov? That takes a little bit of thought to fill in those gaps. But what comes out in the end? What comes out is the fact that that Eov did not suffer for no reason. Whatever happened to him was because of a din, and as much as a righteous person as he actually was, and he was, but there was a din hanging over him, so he wasn't killed, but he became the vehicle to free the Jewish people, measure for measure, because he didn't fulfill the possibility back in Mitzrayim. So whatever chukim, whatever chok we have in the world, right? It's not because it's not understandable. It's because basically you have to go deeper and deeper and deeper yet. For example, shatnez. One of the things I think that Medrash brings down is why we don't wear shatnez. Goes back to Cain and Hevel, because Cain brought the flax, the cheapest stuff he could possibly bring, and Hevel brought the best of his flock, and that's the wool. And wool, didn't match back. They didn't mix nicely back at that time. So therefore, to remind yourselves of what Cain and Hevel were all about, we don't wear shatnez. But who thinks about things like that? We don't buy shatnez and don't take it for checking. It takes a little bit longer. Next time you go to get your stuff checked in shatnez, and the guy says tomorrow, but it's actually the day after that. Just remember Cain and Hevel, right? That's the reason why we're there in the first place, right? So as a result, if that's the case. So the question becomes, okay, fine, so Miriam dies in this week's Parsha, but is there a reason for that? Right? It's a chok, fine. We're saying now the chukim are things that can be understood if you go deeper. Is there a deeper explanation for why Miriam has to die and all that happens after that, including the death of Aaron and Kodesh Parsha? Does it all follow from that? So it happens to be that the Zohar does say the following things, a little bit Kabbalistic. We'll try to explain a little bit so we go through it. It says the following thing. It's in the middle of a section. It says, it was likewise with respect to Miriam, as it says, Miriam died there, and because of this, there was no water for the Eidah, right, the assembly, for when the upper Be'er ascended, I'll explain what that means in a second, which is the Malchus. That's the second. The Malchus, the sphere of Malchus, basically, which corresponds to Miriam. The lower Be'er ceased to give water because it was in the midst of Miriam. In other words, as we know, everything down here happens first up there. Whatever goes on down here, if a mountain gets destroyed, if an earthquake comes along and destroys a mountain, says the Arizal and Shar Gilgulim, it's because the angel, who's the Sar, who's in charge of that mountain, first was destroyed. If a river dries up, if a tree dies, it didn't first happen down here. It happens down here as a consequence of the Sar up in Shemayim first drying up and withering or dying in the process, because that's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu decides to do. So, for example, if Yishmael, as we say, Rav Wilson spoke about a month ago, 2 months ago, he pointed out that all these Arab nations having all these problems with leaders and losing their power and being usurped and all that, and Osama bin Laden being killed, some say 5 years ago, some say this year, depends who asked, right? But he seems to be gone. Or on vacation. We don't know for sure which one, right? But he's missing from the picture right now. So that's because the Sar that correspond to these leaders is being affected back in Shemayim. So if the Be'er Miriam down here dries up for whatever reason, it's because it's drying up first in Shemayim. Something's being removed up to the upper levels. So the sphere of Malchus which we are supposed to be building all the time. That's what we're down here doing. It's the one sphere that we're working on through our Bechira. Right? That first ascended. Right? At that time, the right arm of Zer Ampin, which corresponds to the spheres of Chesed, Gevur, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, the ones above Malchus of Zer Ampin, broke, which is a sort of Aaron. Aaron was rooted in that particular part of the spherot, the right arm of the sphere, so to speak, right? So as a result, he died. As it says, Aaron was gathered unto his people, after which the sun was darkened, that is, Moshe also died. So actually, it's quite amazing over here. Because it turns out, and it's amazing because even sorry. Sit over here. I read my notes together with me, okay?
Maybe it's a kid, all of you, I don't know.
I don't know if you heard what happened last week. Did you read this media story? There was a dog that wandered into, I think, a basement in Yerushalayim. Read this? So and they called the pound to take the dog out and get rid of it. Some court attendant decided to make a story of this thing. That he said in a report to Mariv that the courts decided this dog was a gilgul of somebody who's guilty of things from the past, and therefore was chayiv misa, had to be stoned to death. Called them some from children who like to do things like this to kill the dog. And the Mari printed the story. They actually printed the story. So the court got wind of this thing, and they called the Mari and said, "I'm sorry, it's not what happened. Check it out. You see, it's not true. The whole thing was made up," and they retracted it. After the retraction, the French newspapers and other newspapers in Europe picked up the story and actually printed it.
America also.
Where else? In America also. Right? So it's like,
You happen to see that story.
It's anti-Semitism. Anyhow, side story. Thanks for that. So the point, the bottom line is that what's amazing in this entire thing is the death of Miriam seems to be a sideshow. It seems to be a side issue. Right? The whole thing seems to be very secondary. Yeah, Miriam died along the way. Sad thing. Oh, by the way, the Be'er was in her schus because the water dries up, and that's all past now. So now she's dead. The water is gone. We need new water. So Moshe is forced to go to the rock, hit the rock, whatever, talk to the rock and bring forth water. But we forget about Miriam. But it turns out, from the Zohar's point of view, Miriam's the hinge-pin in the entire thing. Everything resides with her because she's the Malchus. Moshe's success and Aaron's success and the future of Klal Yisrael, the Gul, all of it depends upon her, not her, that's herself, on her, right? It has basically to do with the fact that as long as she's in the world, everything is going to work out the way it's supposed to work out. But if she's taken, then everything begins to fall apart, and her death actually foreshadows the failure of Moshe Rabbeinu coming up in the end. And that's why the bear is the vehicle for Moshe to lose his ability to be able to enter Israel. Because since it all depends upon Miriam in the first place, the whole point of being in this world is to build the Malchus, which really results or is tantamount to building Malchus Shemaim on earth. So she was the one really to whom it was supposed to happen, and this actually fits in beautifully with the Tikkun Zohar, which says that back in Parshas Balosecha, when Miriam got saras because of the fact that she spoke Lashon about Moshe Rabbeinu. So then then Aaron comes to Moshe and says, "Please pray for her because she needs to have a refuah." And he comes back and he sa's El in front of Allah. He mentioned those words that we say in our slichus as well, and never mentions the name Miriam. Never mentions the name Miriam. So the Zohar, Pshat, they asked the question, why not? Why is Miriam not mentioned? You daven for somebody, the first thing you do is mention their name. We go from a Sheberach, the most important part seems to be the mentioning of the person's full name in the year. Not that a Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't know what you're talking about without that. He knows exactly who's not sick, who's not well, and requires a refuah. But we are makir the person, we mention the name. Why would Moshe definitely leave the name out? So some say because he didn't want people to think nepotism, he's showing favoritism, but I think he would have been forgiven for that. To daven too long, it's one thing. But not to mention his own sister's name in the process for refuah shlema, that most people would have had no problem with. So why didn't he mention the name? The Zohar says because he wasn't davening for Miriam. He was davening for the Shekhinah. Because when anybody suffers in the world below, the Shekhinah suffers first. Whatever goes wrong in the world down here, it's because basically there's a lack of flow of divine light coming down into this world. If there's a lack of light flowing into the world, the Shekhinah is suffering. So Moshe sees Miriam, and certainly he feels for her. Certainly he knows the situation is terrible. But it's the same thing. You see your nose running, you don't just deal with the running nose. There's a cold going on over here. You deal with the rest of the body, and all the symptoms combined together by having an all-round cold remedy. So likewise, Moshe says, yeah, there's no question that Miriam has to have a refuah. But the refuah has to be by fixing up the Shekhinah first. And that's why most of our tefillahs don't always, they don't really work the way they're supposed to work. We daven for people, we spell for people, and very often we're not successful. And one of the reasons why is because we're dealing with the symptom and not the cause. Daven for the Shekhinah and everything gets better. Daven for the person, it takes a lot of schuyot. It's not so pashut. So actually, from the Zohar, you see that Moshe understood that Miriam represented the Shekhinah in this world to a large degree. That was her gavs, and that's why she's the one to predict Moshe's coming to the world, and to look out for him, and to be protected, and to rejoin mother and son once again, to raise him properly, and always there the entire time. And she's the one by the Yamsu singing the Shira, v'chulu v'chulu, because Miriam is the vehicle with the Shekhinah works in this world. So as long as the Shekhinah was in the world protecting Klal Yisrael, right? As long as Miriam was there, that Chus was there, the Shekhinah, so therefore the light could flow into the world. That should get her going. That gets me going. As long as the Shekhinah is there, right, to as a conduit for the light to come into the world, everything falls into place. Moshe can be the Mashiach. So that's the reason why it turns out that the whole thing revolves with the story, why it's by the Paraduma first of all, but and why it's not really, it's a chok in as much as she seems to be the one who most should go into the land, but in the end she doesn't, and the reason is because Klal Yisrael seems unfitting, unprepared, unable to be able to go that final step, even though they got to a phenomenally high level. This was like the last stage, and there was one other aspect of it, and that was that just like the Paraduma was a kapara for the Egel Zahav, because as Rashi points out, can we know what the time was?
Come on, quarter past.
Okay, I can see that. So just like take another break. It's a rough night cooking. It's a busy night out there. Just like the Paraduma, as Rashi points out, the Paraduma comes to Mechaper for the Egel, right? Because the Egel is a calf, and the calf doesn't wear a yoke yet, and the Paraduma it's already a heifer. It's a full-grown cow. Responsibility versus the youthfulness of the calf, and the fact that the golden calf is gold represents eternal youth. The idea of the golden calf is basically eternal youth. The calf itself is the youth part. The gold is the eternal part. So the world wants eternal youth, but not because they simply want to stay young. They simply want to stay irresponsible. So the wonderful thing about youth being a child is you have very little responsibility. That's what they were throwing up. They're pork old, backed by the golden calf, whereas the Paraduma represents the idea of the mother, the heifer, red as blood, right? So therefore it symbolizes just the opposite, the reality of everyday life and the need to take responsibility. So the Paraduma, as Rashi points out, cleans up the mess made by the Egel Zahav. Egel Zahav brought death back into the world. The Paraduma is a person from the death itself. Likewise, Miriam also was a kapara for the Egel Zahav, and that was the last stage that apparently was necessary to transform the Jewish people. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock as opposed to speak to the rock? Because the last time HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him to bring along his staff, the mateh, he was told to hit the rock. So what was the difference? So I can't go through the whole thing right now. It's very complicated, but it's a very fascinating thing because you go pasuk by pasuk in this week's Parshah. If you want, I can actually email it to you. You can sit inside. But starting with the fact that the rock is called the Sela and not a Tzur. The first thing the rock is called the Tzur by Har Sinai. Back at the beginning, that was called the Sela. Second of all, the first time Moshe was told to bring Aaron and Cohen and the Zakadim, not the entire nation. This time the Jewish people, and everyone's invited to come and watch the actual miracle take place before their very eyes. There's all kinds of nuances and differences between the first time and this time taking place. So the Zohar explains that the Jewish people were on the other side of the 40 years now. The first time Moshe went to bring water from the rock, they just left Mitzrayim. They're all novices. Moshe was on a fantastically high level, but everybody else was on a low level. They weren't yet. They were still in what the Bechina, what the Zohar calls the level of the Eitz Das Tov Hara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But after the 40 years, And the Shekhinah was literally dwelling on their lips. That's the Lashon of the Zohar, because they learned Torah for 40 years and drank from the bear, which is Torah Shbaksav, and the man, which is Torah, no, the other way around. Man is Torah Shbaksav, and the bear is Torah Shbakpeh. They had all this, and it goes into them, part of their being. The man was like, totally consumed by every part of their body. There was no waste. This level of perfection, then plus the matzah, the stick itself, got to the level Eitz Chaim. So at that point in time, the Zohar says it was a level like a daughter living in the king's palace who wants something, and all she has to do is request it verbally. She doesn't have to go through any long process to get what she wants, because the relationship is such that she can simply request and the king will grant the request. So likewise, the Selah, the rock, and the staff, and the Jewish people were all holding the level of the Eitz Chaim, thanks to the death of Miriam, because that was the last level of Kapara, enough of a Kapara to push the Jewish people up to this fantastically high level, which would have resulted in the miracle that Rashi speaks about the Kol V'chomer, and was the last lesson the Jewish people required before entering Eretz Yisrael. And that's the reason why Moshe is punished with not going in. Because what took place with the Selah was specifically designed to train the Jewish people how to live in Eretz Yisrael. How is that? How is that supposed to work? So the first time this happened was back in Parshas Chukas, also back at the beginning. What happens, if you recall that shir from way back when, right? The Jewish people go out and they're told that they're only going to be able to collect 1 omer of man per day. You take less, you mystically, magically get your omer. You take more, the surplus will rot. You always get 1 omer. The gematria of the word yesh without the vav, it's written in the Chumash, because what you have is what you have, not more, not less. That's your portion in this world, right? So the only difference is Erev Shabbos. They go out to collect an omer of man, and they notice the surplus is not rotting. So they come to the Nesiim, and they say to the Nesiim, look, what's going on? What's different? What's pshat over here? Up until now, we collected 2 omers, and 1 rotted. Today we got 2 omers, and we got 2 omers. They're staying as 2 omers. What's pshat? And the Nesiim go, we don't know. Moshe didn't speak to us about this. It's very strange. Let's go ask Moshe Rabbeinu. They go to Moshe Rabbeinu, they say to Moshe Rabbeinu, what's going on over here? 2 omers, one didn't rot. So Moshe, yeah, right, that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to tell you, and I forgot to tell you, that you should go out, you'll find out, Erev Shabbos, 2 omers of man, Mishnah Lechem Mishnah, right, and you will be able to keep 1 for tomorrow, because you can't cook, can't collect the whole thing, prepare it for Shabbos, in the story. So Sefer called Zev Yitzraf says that you'll notice immediately after that, just like in this week's Parshah, immediately after that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and he complains to Moshe Rabbeinu, says, how long do you people not believe in me? He's talking to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Meforshim point out, why? What's HaKadosh Baruch Hu blaming Moshe? So he explains, because if you look back at the beginning when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu about the man and Erev Shabbos, it says, V'haya b'yom hashishi, when you will go out on the 6th day and collect, you'll collect the man, etc., etc., get a double portion, v'chulu, v'chulu. When they actually collect the extra omer of man, it says, V'yehi b'yom hashishi. And the Gemara Megillah says, V'haya is Lashon Simcha. V'yehi is Lashon Sar for the most part. So what was the Sar? So it says, Yitzraf says that what was supposed to happen is Moshe was supposed to go tell the Jewish people, on the 6th day, you will go out and you'll collect an omer of man. Only 1 omer, not 2 omers. Only 1. Here, not 2. 1 like every other day of the week. Only 1 omer. But when you pick it up, you will say the words L'chavos Shabbos Kodesh, and the 1 omer will become 2. Just like that. What happened instead? They went out, collected 2 omers of man, and the second one didn't become 1. That's called a phenomenon. Scientists will call that a phenomenon because it's a physical reaction.